Is today a quiz day or a test day?
Um, I don't think so.
Okay. So today's just notes, just regular
I
class day?
believe so.
Okay.
have the sign-in sheet back there. We have an issue. And the issue is, we haven't talked about the Industrial Revolution, and I don't think we have time to. Can you hear me out there in Plainview?
Yes.
Okay. Here's the deal. I can put off having the exam scheduled for Wednesday. I can't do the Industrial Revolution and Andrew Jackson in time without really cramming it in, and I don't want to do that. My inclination is to put the exam off until next Monday, so we can also do the Industrial Revolution. The problem is that somewhere along the line, we're going to have to make up some time. Because when it gets down to final exam time, you know, you can't put that off. So what do you think? I can also give you a recording of the Industrial Revolution that you can watch at home if you want. And that way we can do the exam on time. But whatever floats your boat.
The recording.
Would you like to do the recording and not get behind?
Yes.
Okay. It's not a bad recording, if I do say so myself. In fact, I may even have just a straight PowerPoint, which is narrated, that I made a year or so ago. So, yeah, okay, we can do that. So we're talking about Andrew Jackson. Remember, he almost got elected in 1824, but they had that so-called corrupt bargain, so he didn't get elected. And he was bitter about that. He's one of these kind of guys, and I don't blame him. For better or for worse, he's not my favorite president, but for better or for worse, he held grudges. He knew how to hold a grudge. And he did what he said he would do, if he could. He kept his word about things. For better or for worse. Now, I mean, sometimes you promise to do things you might not like. And he still did them. And what we're going to do, when we look at him, as soon as he pops up on the screen here, we'll look at what he says he's going to do at the beginning of his presidency, what he wants to do, and then when we're done with Andrew Jackson, we'll kind of give him a report card, and we'll see what he did. It's interesting. He was born before the American Revolution. He was a teenager, a young teenager during the American Revolution. Well, since the Revolution was 8 years long, at some stage during the Revolution he was a teenager. We don't consider him a veteran, even though he was a little messenger boy during the Revolution. His father died before he was born. We're not sure if he was born in South Carolina, maybe even Virginia, but we do know that he grew up in South Carolina and then moved to Tennessee Territory, and when Tennessee became a state, he already owned land there, and he's going to go into Congress for Tennessee. Not really a politician. Not really a simple man, although you see him advertised as the president for the common man. His life experiences, during the American Revolution, the British caught him one time and beat him up. And then his mother was working as a nurse in a British prisoner of war camp where they were holding American prisoners. And cholera broke out and she died. So by the time he's 14, he has no parents. So he's in a bad situation, but he's one of those people that soldiers through things like that. By the time he's 20 years old, he passed the bar exam in South Carolina. You know what the bar exam is, right? You go all the way through law school normally, then you take this examination to allow you to work in court. And he did that when he was 20. I know a lot of 30-year-olds that still can't pass the bar exam. In 1791, he married Rachel Robards, and if you look at the slide I put there, I put quotes around married. She was the daughter of the landlady where he lived, in the housing that he lived. He was a young single man, and she was divorced from a fellow named Robards. So they got married, and then they discovered that her divorce wasn't final, that the guy hadn't signed some paper he was supposed to sign. And they were both pretty straight-laced people, so they were both really upset by this and rushed over and got the paperwork done right and remarried. But that's going to pop up later on when he gets into politics. He was also one of the 3 original investors, and it says on my slide, and I think it's wrong, who founded Memphis. I think it was Nashville. I may be wrong. At any rate. So he was making money. He had trouble with the banks a few times. Kind of a man's man. He liked fast horses. He liked a drink now and then. He liked to fist fight now and then. He was elected to Congress for a brand new state of Tennessee in 1796. He was elected to the Senate the following year. It turns out I think he was too young for the Senate, so he had to leave the Senate, and he's going to get on the Tennessee Supreme Court at a very young age. In 1802, he became commander of the Tennessee Militia. We talked about that in the War of 1812. By that time, he was well established in the militia. I think he got to be commander of the Tennessee Militia after a bar brawl with another guy that wanted to do the job. Of course, we know about him winning the Battle of Horseshoe Bend during the War of 1812, and we also know that as a result of that battle, he got a commission in the U.S. Army as a brigadier general, and then was promoted to major general pretty quickly, same month, and led American forces in the Battle of New Orleans. We also talked about, when we were talking about the Monroe presidency, the fact that he led soldiers down into Spanish territory, and there was a big brouhaha in Congress, or not in Congress, but in the cabinet about that. John C. Calhoun wrote a letter to the president saying we ought to lock this guy up or fire him or something. And I may have mentioned, or you may not remember this, that letter, if you have to say something like that, if you can avoid writing it down, it's always a good idea. I've learned from that. That letter's going to come around and bite John C. Calhoun in the butt, because it's not gone. It's just put in somebody's storage somewhere. Of course, he'll be defeated by John Quincy Adams in the election he called the corrupt bargain with the help of Henry Clay. So obviously, he's not a good friend of Henry Clay's. And he's not a friend of John Quincy Adams, even though Quincy Adams was the only guy on the cabinet that said, don't give him a hard time about going into Spanish territory. Those are the results, by the way, of the election of 1824. Just to see the numbers, you got 151,000 plus popular votes compared to John Quincy Adams, 113,000 plus, and yet John Quincy Adams won. Because Congress voted on it. We talked about the Tariff of Abominations that was passed by a group of people. It was pushed by a group of people, including John C. Calhoun, kind of pushing from the rear, to embarrass John Quincy Adams into vetoing the bill. They passed a really nasty tariff, and they figured it would make Quincy Adams veto it, and then he'd lose the support of his own political base. It didn't work out that way. John Quincy Adams was going to lose the election anyway. Andrew Jackson didn't need Calhoun's help. Of course, Calhoun's going to have to write the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, asserting the right to nullify. That will also come around and bite him in the butt. In the election of 1828, he wins thumbs down. 178 electoral votes to 83. He's in office. People call him the symbol of democracy. People call him the president for the common man. He was not a common man. He was wealthy. He was a special person. But yes, the common man really, really worshipped him. He was like President Grant. You know, back then they didn't have a lot of security following people around and all that. But wherever Ulysses S. Grant walked in Washington, people would want to run up to him and shake his hand so they could tell their grandchildren, I shook Ulysses S. Grant's hand. And the same thing with Andrew Jackson. Of course, we know about Calhoun, who's going to gradually slide from being a nationalist to a states' rights kind of guy. And as he does that, he's going to lose Jackson's respect. Well, there's other things that cause him not to like, or Jackson not to like him. Then there's Martin Van Buren. He'll start out as Secretary of State. He gets that job because he helped Jackson get the votes from New York. Talk about that later. First Secretary of War is one of Jackson's war buddies, a guy named John Eaton from Tennessee. He's going to not last very long. We'll talk about that. The next Secretary of War will be Lewis Cass from Michigan. He fought in the War of 1812. He was governor of Michigan Territory for a while. He was Secretary of War for a while, etc. Look at the Secretaries of the Treasury. I think this is neat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Secretaries of the Treasury. He went through them pretty fast. You'll understand why in a minute. The last one was Levi Woodbury. Some interesting people. Then there was his kitchen cabinet. What is that? Well, he had a bunch of buddies and they hung around the White House. So people started calling him the kitchen cabinet because some people felt they were unhappy that he had all these friends who were kind of informal advisors. They weren't government employees or anything, and people thought they had unfair influence over the president. 2 of them were newspaper guys. That's interesting. One of them was his wife's nephew, A.J. Donaldson, named after Andrew Jackson. Then there was Judge John Overton. He was his business partner in Tennessee. William Lewis was an officer that served with him and helped him as his campaign manager when he was running for president. And Roger B. Taney was also a member of the kitchen cabinet, but after 1831 became the Attorney General and then played an interesting role in the saga of Andrew Jackson later on, and eventually ends up being the Chief Justice of the United States. This is what Andrew Jackson said he wanted to do. He wanted to get rid of the National Bank. He didn't like banks to start with, but the National Bank he felt was dangerous because it concentrated too much of our wealth in one place. He wanted to get rid of the Electoral College. Well, we know why he wanted to get rid of that. If it hadn't been for the Electoral College, he would have been president in 1824. He wanted to get rid of national debt. That's fair enough. He wanted to move the Indians west of the Mississippi. He felt that the Indian sort of culture and the white man's sort of culture just couldn't live side by side. And he wanted the U.S. to stop being a second-rate nation. He wanted the world to recognize us as a world power. He wanted us to be able to do trade everywhere. And we still were having trouble doing it down in the Caribbean. He wanted to get most favored nation treaties from all the big economic powers in the world. What is a most favored nation treaty? I'm trying to think of a really simple way to put it. They're bilateral treaties between one country and another country, not a group of countries. And what they guarantee is, let's say I make one I have a bilateral most favored nation treaty with England. That means if I give any other country a really good deal about anything, I have to give England at least that good a deal because they're our most favored nation. And the idea here was to boost our position in the world economy. He also wanted to collect all the debts that were owed to us ranging from as far back as the quasi-war with France, some of the Spanish revolutions in South America, where we'd lost shipping and things like that because of the war. Nobody had paid us back, although there were acknowledged debts, they just didn't pay us. And so he plans he's going to go out and collect them. Those are the things he said very clearly, these are what I want to do as president. Yeah, the issues. There are 4 major crises we'll study under Andrew Jackson. And there's one particular characteristic that he gets stuck with, perhaps unfairly. The first thing is that he is connected with something called the spoils system. You know, there's an old saying, to the victor belong the spoils. Or they use the word, the spoils of war. This all comes from, the terminology anyway, comes from the behavior of people in the 13, 14, 1500s. People didn't pay their armies very well. They didn't pay them very much at all. And the way that soldiers got the money that they would get, the way that they made money, was when they conquered a place, they were just turned loose there. They could rape, pillage, and steal to their heart's content. And that was called the spoils of war. You got that as a natural result of winning that battle or that war. I know the 30 Years' War in Europe was really bad about that. In terms of politics, the spoils system meant that if you got elected, then you needed to give the people that helped you get elected jobs. And the important thing about picking these people to give jobs to was that the only thing you judged by was how much they helped you in getting elected. So under the spoils system, how smart a person was or how able they were, it didn't really figure. How much public service the person had done wasn't considered. How much service the person had done for you was considered. People said that Andrew Jackson started this spoils system. That's not true. Every president had been giving jobs away to his buddies since the first president. He did rotate a lot of people in and out of office. He fired a lot of people. But there was corruption in the Department of the Treasury. There was corruption in the Postal Service. There was corruption in the Department of War. There was corruption in the Department of Navy. You know, there's big money being spent buying equipment and buying this and that, and people were just getting hold of a whole lot of it and putting it in their pockets. Kickbacks and things like that. So during his presidency, he's going to get rid of a whole bunch of people, starting with the Department of the Treasury, but moving to the post office and the whole 9 yards, trying to clean up the corruption. He never got rid of all of it, but he actually made some inroads into it, especially in the Department of Treasury and in the Department of the Navy. So, he is connected with the spoils system, perhaps unfairly. I'm saying all the nice things about him because when I get done, I won't be so nice about him. There's a cartoon, an anti-Jackson cartoon, about the spoils system. If you can't see that cartoon clearly, out there you can't see it because I haven't pushed the button yet. There it is. It's Andrew Jackson riding on a big pig. And the little plaque on the statue says, "To the victors belong the spoils." And there's little words scribbled all over it like fraud, bribery, plunder, things like that. The names I have on there, Martin Van Buren, the Secretary of State, clearly helped Jackson get elected and got the plum job of Secretary of State. I would offer to you that Martin Van Buren was qualified to be the Secretary of State. Sam Swartwout's a different story. He also worked with Martin Van Buren to get the vote out in New York to help get Jackson elected. And he wasn't some guy that just came out of the closet somewhere out of the blue. He knew lots of people in the Democratic Republican Party, and then when it became the Democratic Party, he knew lots of people. He knew former presidents, former members of Congress, that sort of thing. He gets the job of collector of the Port of New York, which means that all the tariff money and all that that's paid in by incoming ships when their cargoes are unloaded, it all goes through his fingers, which turned out to be rather sticky fingers. He ripped the government off for something in the vicinity of, let's see if I've got a number here. I don't have a number here. It's $1,200,000 or something like that, which and nowadays would probably be worth $100 million. And when people started paying attention to it, he took an extended vacation in Europe to get away. That was a good example of hiring the wrong person for the wrong reason. There's another Andrew Jackson cartoon, King Andrew, born to command, it says. Makes other remarks about him. Okay, the first big issue, we will call it, just number them, it's 1 through 4. Number 1, the Petticoat Affair. This interfered with the working of Jackson's cabinet. It all starts because he gave his wartime buddy, John Eaton, who was a senator by this time, the job of Secretary of War. John Eaton had a girlfriend that he married before he became Secretary of War by the name of Margaret O'Neill Timberlake. She was a widow. It was said by a lot of people, and who knows, that she was a widow because her husband committed suicide because she was messing around with Senator Eaton. Don't know. We do know that he was dead. So John Eaton married her. Now, the other ladies, wives of the cabinet, Florida Calhoun, the wives of the other high officials in the cabinet, and Emily Donaldson, who was Andrew Jackson's wife's niece, and she worked in the White House. They didn't like Peggy O'Neill. I've got to tell you the story about Andrew Jackson's wife. I did mention the bit about them getting married, thinking they were married, and then having to get remarried. Well, other people found that. And during the campaign in 1828, they started a smear campaign, calling them bigamists and all sorts of things like that. And it put a great deal of pressure on Mrs. Jackson. And she developed heart condition. I have no idea, back then we didn't have that much science. But he had just been elected. He was the president-elect. It was December of 1828, and she collapsed in the kitchen of their home and died in his arms. And he was so distraught that they had to peel him away from his wife so they could take her to the undertakers. And all he could think of was, you people calling my wife a woman of low repute, you people calling my wife a bigamist, you killed her. He knew how to keep a grudge, too. The reason I tell you that story is because now, in his own cabinet, all the women in the cabinet are looking at Mrs. Margaret Eaton, otherwise known as Peggy O'Neill, as being a lowlife, and they don't want to talk to her. So I want to invite her over to their place. You know how a cabinet sometimes works like a little club. Everyone together, people get together and meet, and families meet and all of that. She's ostracized. And it's getting where it causes stiffness between the members of the cabinet. It's interfering with Jackson's programs, and Jackson says, knock it off. Cut that out, I don't like it. And nobody listens to him or no one responds, especially Florida Calhoun. So he says it in a different way. He calls all his cabinet officers together and he says, get your wives in line. And of course, we all know that nobody can get his wife in line, so it's trouble. And by 1831, he fires his entire cabinet, every one of them. Well, let's see, every one of them. Martin Van Buren resigned. He didn't get fired. He resigned to be fair to the other people. Martin Van Buren was out of the argument because he was a single man. So he didn't have a wife to sneer at Peggy O'Neill. Samuel Ingham, Secretary of the Treasury, out, 1831. Secretary of War John Eaton, out. Attorney General Berrien, out. Postmaster General, left him alone. Talk about that later. I think Andrew Jackson was planning to put him in jail. Secretary of the Navy, out. All the major guys in his cabinet out before the end of 1831. In fact, fairly early in 1831. Martin Van Buren, you might want to remember this, Martin Van Buren came to him and said, I better resign too, just to make it fair, make it a clean sweep. And the president said, well, let me give you a job, a different job. And he said, why don't you go be my ambassador in England to the court of St. James? Martin Van Buren liked that. Senate wasn't in session, so it's what you call a recess appointment. Later on, it will have to be confirmed by the Senate. So off to England goes Martin Van Buren, and he starts picking new members for his cabinet. This takes us to the end of 1831. Then there's another issue. Now, remember, Calhoun tried to help Jackson get elected and supported him in 1824 and in 1828. I'm not sure that Jackson trusted Calhoun that much, but, I mean, they were political allies. But that friendship is going to start to break down as Calhoun starts going more and more in the direction of states' rights. And in part because of the nullification crisis that we're about to talk about. And in part because of the petticoat affair that we've already talked about and Calhoun's wife's role in that. So you're starting to see a split between the president and the vice president. Of course, it probably all started, this nullification crisis started with the South Carolina Exposition and Protest before Jackson was president, written by Calhoun. Then, in 1830, so Jackson comes into office in March of 1829. So he hasn't been president for half a year yet. There was a debate in the Senate between Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. And it starts out as a debate on whether or not the federal government should sell Western lands. The federal government wants to sell them to raise money, if nothing else. Daniel Webster doesn't like it, argues against the sale of Western land because the people of New England didn't like Western land being sold. Why? It's subtracted from their population when people moved out there. It lessened their share of the pie as far as the whole country is concerned. The Southerners tended to favor Western land sales. They were agriculturally inclined. This fight, after a few days, degenerates not into an argument about the land sale. They kind of forget what they're arguing about. And it starts being a states' rights against federal rights argument, with Webster arguing on the side of federal rights and Hayne arguing on the side of states' rights. And Hayne really did better in the debate. They were both good debaters. Webster was a famous lawyer who'd done cases before the Supreme Court, so he could certainly hold his own. And in his concluding remarks, Webster makes this tearjerker speech about, when I die, may I die seeing the flag flying over my wonderful country, liberty and union now and forever, one and inseparable. Go figure, break my heart, play my violin, but it really appealed to the public. The guys in the Congress were probably all holding their nose, but it made a difference. That's in January of 1830. Then in April of 1830, words matter. You have to understand that with people like this, and people out here where we live, not so much nowadays, but in the old days, words mattered out here too. You just didn't say things. I don't know if you guys have ever been exposed to people like that, but we never said anything. If there was someone you really didn't like, you avoided saying bad things about them. Because it was a serious thing to say bad things. If you go to New York, people are saying bad things about everybody. Well, amongst these politicians, words mattered. On Jefferson's Day, at the Jefferson's Day reception, there's a lot of wine and booze flowing. And all the big wigs in politics are together. It's a celebration because they all claim to be followers of Thomas Jefferson, whether they are or not. Senator Robert Hayne raises his glass and offers a toast to the Union of the States and the sovereignty of the states. Sounds like states' rights to me. Andrew Jackson quickly, after everyone knocks off that glass of booze, Andrew Jackson quickly answers with his own toast, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." Oops. The crowd gets a little bit quieter. The Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun, raises his glass. "The Union, next to our liberty, most dear. May we all remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states and distributing equally the benefit and burden of the Union." Martin Van Buren then offered, let's get together kind of toast, like let's be nice to each other kind of toast, because this looked like war. It's like throwing down the gauntlet. You all know what that means, right? When you throw down the gauntlet. Okay, in the good old days, in the days of yore, when men were men and all that baloney, when they dueled, the way to challenge a guy to duel was to throw your gauntlet down in front of his face on the ground. Tell him to pick it up. If the guy reached down and picked it up, he accepted your challenge. That's what it looked like in these toasts. To you or me, drinking a toast when everyone's drinking booze is fun. But it was serious business to them, especially when the President of the United States was involved. Then, even worse, in May, same year, the President finds a copy of John C. Calhoun's letter to President President Monroe, saying that Andrew Jackson should be fired. And an old controversy is relit. Here's the controversy. When Jackson did that, when he went down into Spanish territory, he made the offer to the president, if you want me to really grab the territory, but you don't want to say it out loud, just send me a message through a trusted intermediary, and I'll do it, and I'll take the blame. Jackson claims he got that letter from a guy named Rhea, who was a former congressman. Everyone else denies he ever got the letter. No one's ever produced the letter to this day. But until he died, Jackson insisted that President Monroe had actually asked him to do that. This now becomes an issue all over again. They're just throwing stuff at each other, basically. And then, when we get up to 1832 rather, at the beginning of 1832, Congress comes back into session. They have to confirm Martin Van Buren's appointment as ambassador to England, and the vote comes out a tie. If there's a tie in the Senate, who breaks the tie? You should know that because we have a tie in the Senate right now. Who breaks the tie? Come on, somebody. Who breaks the tie in the Senate? It's the only time that person can vote in the Senate. Nobody? Plainview? You should know it just from reading the newspapers right now. You don't know? Who breaks the tie in the Senate? The President of the Senate, otherwise known as the Vice President of the United States, breaks the tie in the Senate. It's a tie, and John C. Calhoun, the Vice President, votes against confirming the President's nominee. Senator Benton of Missouri says, ooh, bad idea. You just shot yourself through the foot. I'll translate that from what he really said. You have broken a minister and made a vice president. What he's saying is, he just turned Martin Van Buren into our next vice president because he ain't going to have the job anymore. John Tyler from Virginia told a friend Van Buren has been elevated by the silly thing of rejecting him. And boy, were they right. Because in the election of 1832, John C. Calhoun is dropped from the ticket for vice president. Come on, slide. My beautiful slide's got to come up. So it's Andrew Jackson for president, Martin Van Buren for vice president, and bye-bye John C. Henry Clay and John Sargent will run against them, and they don't stand a snowball's chance in a hot place. Okay. There goes the friendship. Totally goes the friendship of John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson, if there was ever any such thing. Now, the nullification issue. We talked about the speeches. We talked about the arguments over states' rights. In 1828, that terrible tariff was passed. In 1832, while Calhoun was still vice president, he got together with Henry Clay of Kentucky, and they hammered out a compromise tariff so that South Carolina wouldn't get so upset about the tariff. Of all the southern states, most of them didn't like the tariffs, but of all the southern states, South Carolina was having severe financial problems. They were losing population. People were moving to other places that were nicer. They were very defensive about this. And there are a group of politicians there that call themselves the nullifiers. In fact, John C. Calhoun never admitted that he was a Democrat to start with. He said he was a nullifier from the word go. So they passed this compromise in 1832, but South Carolina took one look at it and said, that's not enough. And they passed an ordinance. On the 24th day of November, 1832, we, the people of the state of South Carolina, do declare and ordain, blah, 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 the tariff of 1828 and the tariff of 1832 are unauthorized by the Constitution of the United States and violate the true meaning and intent thereof and are null and void and no law. They've nullified both of those tariffs, at least as far as South Carolina is concerned. I've got to point out and reemphasize that South Carolina was going it on their own. The other southern states might not have liked the tariff, but they weren't going to try this nullification game. And they actually warned, some of them warned their friends in South Carolina, don't do this. You're causing yourself trouble. Andrew Jackson very quickly turned around, well, quickly for those days. This happened on the 24th of November. On the 10th of December, he basically issues a proclamation to the people of South Carolina saying, your nullification is unconstitutional. Then on the 28th, Got to skip a couple. On the 28th of December 1832, Vice President John C. Calhoun quits. Well, I mean, the election was already over. Jackson and Martin Van Buren won. He was going to be out of a job in March anyway. And the people in South Carolina said, look, our governor died. Robert Haynes is going to become the governor. We want you to take his place as senator. So John C. Calhoun quits as Vice President of the United States ahead of the end of his term, travels to South Carolina, becomes the senator from South Carolina. Meantime, I've got to tell you this one too. At one point, sometime before all of this, somebody passed through, the word nullification had already been mentioned, somebody passed through the president's office and said, I'm headed for South Carolina. Do you have any messages for your friends down there? And the president gave him a message. Give my compliments to my friends in your state and say to them that if a single drop of blood shall be shed there in opposition to the laws of the United States, I will hang the first man I can lay my hand on engaged in such treasonable conduct. Doesn't play around with words, does he? What else? Well, he had been warned that it looked like the South Carolinians were trying to subvert some of the American Army officers that were on the bases down around Charleston, South Carolina. So I told the Secretary of War, rotate those guys out. Keep exchanging them so they can't, I can't think of the word for it now, so they can't subvert these people. And then later on, some of his friends down in South Carolina and Kentucky are telling him they're raising militia down in South Carolina. It looks like they're going after some of the federal forts down there. So the president tells the Secretary of War, he tells General Winfield Scott, tells the Secretary of the Navy that an attempt may be made to surprise the forts and garrisons by militia. So he tells them, you've got to be prepared for this. And he tells Winfield Scott, prepare a force to go down there and enforce the law if they decide to break it. So Winfield Scott does that. And he goes down to South Carolina and he puts extra troops in Fort Moultrie and Castle Pinckney, in or around Charleston Harbor. Winfield Scott's no fool, and he doesn't go down there in a warlike manner. He just goes down there, he moves the troops down there and says, everyone stay away from the people in the town, don't bother them, be good citizens, don't cause trouble we don't need to cause. In fact, there's a fire in Charleston, and the U.S. Army brings people in to help put the fire out for them. And they gain the gratitude of the people of Charleston for that. But the politicians leading South Carolina aren't buying into this friendship stuff. John C. Calhoun doesn't want this to happen. He gets together with Henry Clay and others, and they work out a compromise tariff. They show it to the president. The president sends it to Congress. Some other people have also sent to Congress a force bill, and both of them are acted upon in early 1833. The force bill gives the president the right to use military troops to enforce the law in South Carolina. The compromise tariff offers South Carolina a gradual relief from all the tariffs that they were complaining about. South Carolina gets the compromise tariff. They read it, they grab it like a drowning man grabs a life jacket, because they really don't want to go to war with all these soldiers that are now living next door to them. They kind of painted themselves into a corner, and they view this as a way to get out of it. And then, as kind of an oh yeah at the end of it, they nullified the force bill. But nobody cared, because once they got rid of their nullification ordinance, the issue was over with. So there was a lot of posturing, and no one came to blows, and finally the issue's over with. The other southern states, by the way, wanted nothing to leave us out of this. We're not nullifying anything, just don't bother us. There's old Calhoun going. There's the great compromiser. Henry Clay of Kentucky. He's already done the Missouri Compromise. Now he's done the Tariff Compromise of 1833. He'll do others before he's dead. Remember, he was also involved in negotiating the end of the War of 1812. Indian removal. Issue number 3. I think that's issue number 3. Does that look like issue number 3 to you? Depends on whether you count the petticoat thing as one of the issues. Indian removal. The president always felt. He felt that from the time that he was in the Tennessee militia, that the Indians needed to be moved to the west. Didn't think the federal government had done enough about that. Let's look at a chronology. 1828, the state of Georgia. They have a lot of Cherokees there. The Cherokees have a reservation or just their own property in Georgia. It's very nice land. It's good farmland. It's rich in minerals too. Georgia makes the laws taking away some of the rights of the Cherokees and forbidding people to go into that reservation territory unless they have permission from the state of Georgia. They're trying to put the squeeze on the Cherokees. Let me point out about the Cherokees. Except for skin color, the Cherokees could have been white. They lived in houses, they put fences around their farms, they had their own school system, they had their own language, they had support in Congress. This was not a bunch of ragtag people. And Georgia was continually trying to pressure them to sell their land. That law of 1828 was one of the means with which they were pressuring them. Then in 1830, the Black Hawk War breaks out. Doesn't last very long, but it scared Congress. And before it's over, they passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. It gives the executive branch of the government, or the president anyway, the power to negotiate the sales of Indian lands in the East and to purchase land for them in the West and move them there. Now that one civilized group, I'm not saying that the other ones weren't civilized, the Cherokee, they've got some big influence, especially from the National Republican Party. People like Henry Clay, Theodore Frelinghuysen, Daniel Webster, Davy Crockett. All these people are supporting the Indian side of the argument. In fact, that's one of the reasons that Davy Crockett stopped being a protege of Andrew Jackson, because Andrew Jackson felt he turned on me on this. Davy Crockett took the side of the Indians. They bring suit against the state of Georgia. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And the court really never ruled on the issue. The court said, you're not really a nation, so you have no standing before this court because as individuals, you're not even American citizens. The Cherokees are shocked. Their lawyers told them that you've got a good chance of winning this. And then Georgia makes a mistake. There's a couple of guys, I think they're teachers, and they come down and visit on Cherokee land to help the Cherokees out a little bit. And Georgia arrests them for breaking that law of 1828 because they didn't have a permit to go to the Indian reservation from the state. This is going to work its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the court case will be Worcester, I know it's spelled Worcester, but it's pronounced Worcester. Worcester versus Georgia. This is a horse of a different color from Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. In Worcester versus Georgia, Mr. Worcester is an American citizen. And basically the Supreme Court said Mr. Worcester is in the right. The state of Georgia does not have the power to determine who can go on those reservations. The state of Georgia has no power over that Indian tribe. That does not please President Jackson. Of course, the Cherokees say, "Ah, we win." But did they win? The president says, in no uncertain terms, he's not going to support that court decision. I don't know if he really said this or not, and there's some question about it. But someone quoted the president as saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." The implication being that the president wouldn't. Some other quote too. And he is going to help Georgia press along with forcing the Cherokees to sell their land. And eventually there will be a massive relocation. They concentrate 1,200 Indians, mainly Cherokees, put it under the control of the army, and they're going to move them out west. They start out with 12,000, 8,000 get there. A lot of the other ones die even before the trip started, and some of them just faded away into the woodwork, and if you go to Georgia, you can find that their descendants are still there. In fact, they have some gambling casinos there on the west side of the Great Smoky. What's the name of the town? Country western music town. Can't remember the name of it. At any rate, the president didn't like that. Here's a map. They started in the 30s moving Indians wherever they could. If they could persuade them to sell out, they'd move them over into what is now Oklahoma. They called it back then Indian Territory. Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and even some Seminole. Why are Seminole kind of important to us? Nobody knows, huh? Anybody out here West Texan? What did Seminoles do out here? They were the scouts for the Buffalo Soldiers. Why? Why did they make good scouts to work for the Buffalo Soldiers? Because Seminoles were actually a mixture of races between Africans and Creek Indians and some other groups. And so they fit in really well with the Buffalo Soldiers, and they're probably the ones that named the Buffalo Soldiers the Buffalo Soldiers. You know who the Buffalo Soldiers are, right? Those are the people that cleared the Comanches off of the Llano Estacado where we're standing or sitting right now. They were African Americans. They were members of different cavalry units who were all black, except for their commanding officers. And they were active out here into the 1870s. They were active as segregated units up until the Korean War, some of them. At any rate, that's the Indian removal. Let's talk about another crisis. Let's talk about the National Bank. Mr. Biddle's bank. Remember, way back in 1819, there was a bank crisis, there was corruption in the bank, there was an international economic issue at the time too, and Langdon Cheves of South Carolina had been called upon to fix the bank. And he fixed the bank. And when he got done with it, about 3 years after he took the bank over, he handed it over to the management of a fellow named Nicholas Biddle from New Jersey. Biddle was a graduate of Princeton University. I don't know if it was Princeton already or if it was still called Queen's University, Queen's College. At any rate, he was good at what he did. A lot of people didn't like him because he looked like he was an aristocrat. He carried himself that way. He was not embarrassed to use the bank's money to gain leverage over congressmen to protect the bank. A lot of people didn't like the bank for that reason. A lot of people thought that the bank only helped people that were rich get richer. That was what Andrew Jackson thought about it. When he came into office, December of 1829, that same year he came into office, he made a speech about getting rid of the bank. Congress supported the bank, though, in March and April of the next year. He condemned the bank in December of 1830. Thomas Hart Benton, his friend from Missouri, the guy he got in a fist fight with back in their young days. He condemned the bank on the floor of the Senate in February 1831. In December of 1831, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster get one of these bright ideas that never works. They want to tangle the president in the issue of the national bank to keep him from getting reelected. Congress passes a recharter of the bank. They didn't need to yet. The bank charter didn't end until 1836. But they raised that issue right at the beginning of 1832 to cause trouble for Jackson so he might have trouble getting reelected by causing him to veto it. They passed a bill renewing the charter through the Senate, through the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson vetoed it, and he made a big speech to the American people explaining why he vetoed it, and it didn't affect his reelection at all. He thought that it concentrated too much money, of our federal money, in one place. He thought that was dangerous. He thought that it exposed our government to foreign control. Why? Well, his problem was that you have to understand how the National Bank was. It was actually a private bank in which we put our federal money. At least 4/5 of the money in that bank were from private investors. And anybody who had money could invest, even a foreigner. And so the president felt concerned that foreigners might interfere with our money supply. He thought that this bank favored the northeastern states too much. He thought it served to make the rich people richer, and he also thought, and he was justified to some extent, he thought that this bank tended to be able to protect itself by controlling members of Congress by what? Giving them money. Not necessarily, quote, specifically bribes. What they do is give them easy loans. Sometimes they even loaned them money, and when that money wasn't paid back, they just loaned them more. So there was some validity to what Jackson said, but not that much. Here's kind of a chronology of it, to make a long story short. When he was reelected in 32, remember he'd gone through one Secretary of the Treasury already because of the Petticoat affair. Secretary of the Treasury Lewis McLean won't help him get rid of the National Bank. He's got an idea how to fix the National Bank once and for all. We'll just remove all the federal money from the National Bank and put it in other banks. Pick small local banks that we trust. We trust means they're owned by Democrats. Eventually they're going to get 23 of them. So the president says to Louis McLean, I want you to remove all the money from the federal banks and start depositing it in this list of banks we're going to give you. And Louis McLean told the president, I don't think that's illegal, which is not what the president wanted to hear. So the president, Louis McLean, was a valued member of the cabinet. The president promotes Louis McLean to Secretary of State. That gets rid of him. Now he appoints a new Secretary of Treasury. His name is William Duane. He's from Pennsylvania. And Duane doesn't know Treasury from anything, so he asked former Secretary of the Treasury McLean, what should I do now? McLean, who had urged him to take the job, says, you can't remove the money from the bank, it's not legal. So Duane tells the President of the United States, I can't do it because it's not legal. So the President fires Duane. That's, 3 down. And he goes to his cabinet, his kitchen cabinet probably, and says, will no one do what I ask of him? And his secretary, or his attorney general says, I will. Roger B. Taney, a member of his regular cabinet, also a member of his kitchen cabinet. So while Congress is out of session, he makes a recess appointment, makes Roger B. Taney the new Secretary of the Treasury, and Roger B. Taney starts taking the money out of the National Bank on the 1st of October, 1833. The government, or the Congress, is going to vote to censure the president. That's one step weaker than impeaching him. And when Congress comes back into session, they're not going to confirm Roger B. Taney as Secretary of the Treasury. So they moved the Secretary of the Navy over to be Secretary of the Treasury. His name is Levi Woodbine. By the way, in the meantime, Johnson pleases the American people by finishing the payoff of the entire national debt the 1st of January, 1835. On the 30th of January, 1835, a guy by the name of Richard Lawrence was going to try and kill Andrew Jackson. They didn't have, a whole bevy of, Secret Service. We didn't have that kind of Secret Service yet, presidential protection. He was walking out of the Capitol building, and this guy pops out from behind a column in the Capitol building, pulls a pistol out, pulls the trigger, it doesn't go off. So throws that one down, pulls the second one out, and pulls the trigger, and that doesn't go off either. And Jackson turns around with his walking stick and starts beating the dickens out of this guy. I think Davy Crockett and another guy had to pull him apart so Jackson didn't kill him. Nobody wanted the president to kill somebody. Causes big trouble. At the end of his office, almost the end of his term of office, in 1836, July 1836 and 1837, Andrew Jackson wants to speed up the death of the National Bank. It's not going to get reconfirmed while he's president. It's going to expire at the end of 1836. Nicholas Biddle privatizes the bank. He changes its charter so it's a totally private bank now. The president issues something called the Specie Circular in July of 1836. He tells the Secretary of the the Secretary of the Treasury, that for sale of national lands, you can only accept gold or silver, specie, hard money. If it's a small purchase like a real farmer that wants land, he delays it a little bit. But for everybody else, you got to pay in specie, in cash. No checks. In January of 1837, after a new Congress has been elected, they erased the censure against the president. There's also another bill passed called the Distribution Act, and that says that all surpluses in the Treasury will be distributed proportionately to all the states. They'll give them their money back, in other words, in proportion to their representation in Congress. So it's graduated according to population, basically. All of these things together mean that in it'll be 1841 before the institution just totally goes bankrupt, but the bank's finished by the time Jackson walks out of office. And that's the last of Jackson's issues. We talked about the argument with the bank. There's some of the cartoons about Jackson fighting the bank. The bank looks like an octopus, kind of. One last thing to come out of this. Now, getting rid of the bank is going to really mess up our economic stability. Jackson won't be president when it happens, but it'll happen. The other thing is Roger B. Taney, who temporarily left the job of Attorney General to be the Secretary of the Treasury, is giving his reward for helping finish off the National Bank. The President of the United States makes him the Chief Justice of the United States. Oops, how did that happen? In 1835, where is he? John Marshall passed away. So we don't have a Chief Justice. We'll go back and look at John Marshall in a sec. The result of the bank war: economic disruption and a really strong two-party system, but it won't be the National Republicans anymore. They will join together with people that don't like Freemasons and a bunch of other groups, and they will form a party called the Whigs. The only qualification you need to be a Whig party member is to dislike Andrew Jackson. But Andrew Jackson, even though he's not the president anymore, is a tremendously powerful man. The Whigs are pro-federal government. And they use the argument of the depression that's going to come to our country in 1837 against anyone who supports Jackson. It's interesting about the anti-Mason people. A lot of our presidents were members of the Freemasons. George Washington was. I think Thomas Jefferson was. So where this came from, I don't know. But some people felt that the Freemasons were kind of like a undercover private government or something. I don't think that's true, but that's what they thought. In 1836, the election that will elect a replacement for Jackson, the Whigs come up with a brilliant idea. If we run enough candidates, maybe we'll split the electoral vote so it will go back to the Congress. And we still have the majority in Congress, so maybe we can get one of our guys elected, only if Martin Van Buren doesn't get enough electoral votes to put him over the top. He has to get 148 to get over the top. So they nominate 4 nominees instead of 1 for president. William Henry Harrison of Ohio, Hugh White of Tennessee, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, Willie Mangum of North Carolina, although Willie Mangum is considered a candidate of a different party, but they're really all Whigs. But their great big plot does not work. Van Buren's going to get 170 electoral votes. All he needed was 148. Harrison will get a lot of votes. White will get a lot of votes. Webster will get some. Mangum doesn't get anything. Jackson scorecard, there it is, as we conclude for today. The only thing in that list of things that he said he was going to do that he didn't do was get rid of the Electoral College. Everything else he achieved. He collected all the debts that were owed to us, sometimes by negotiation, sometimes by sending some warships over to visit, whatever it took. He collected them from the French, he collected them from the Spanish, everyone that owed us money. He secured a lot of most favored nation treaties. He opened those West Indian ports. He moved the Indians. He destroyed the National Bank. Paid off the national debt. The thing was, he defied the Supreme Court. The thing was, after he left office, we're going to go into a terrible economic crisis because we don't have the stability of a national bank. And for years after that, we're going to suffer. We still don't have a national bank, but we have the Fed, which kind of replaced the national bank. John C. Marshall dies. I don't have time to go over them, but these are some of the court cases that he was over the court in, from Marbury versus Madison, all the way down to Worcester versus Georgia. In the slides, which you have, I've listed the major cases and what they were about. Read those. Maybe I'll give you a cheat sheet with all of them on it. The second party system, the Whigs, want a liberal state, a positive state, an activist state, community over the individual. Democrats support negative liberal state, individual rights. They both share a broad idea of democracy, just different approaches to it. In conclusion, Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman who came over and wrote about democracy, praised most aspects of the American democracy. This is back about the time that Andrew Jackson was around. But he warned of future disaster for the United States if white males refused to extend liberty to women, African Americans, and Indians. Strange, he should say that. Still have that to think about. Okay, I will put up this afternoon, as soon as I get home, I will put up